The envelope was small, heavy with a kind of deliberateness I could feel through the paper. When I slid my thumb beneath the flap in Alan's office, a cool, dry scent, old paper and cedar, rose up and steadied me. There was a key inside, dangling from a maple leaf keychain, and a single line in my uncle's spidery handwriting, "Never go to the farm, Catherine." Under that, Joshua had signed his name, and then, as if to contradict his own script, written, "But if you do, start in the loft." Before I say anything else, if this matters to you in the way it mattered to me, stay to the end, like and subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps people who tell long, strange stories like this find one another. The key was colder than I expected. I held it between forefinger and thumb at the drive-through window of a coffee shop I hardly remembered coming into. Jenna sat across from me with her hands wrapped around a paper cup, eyes rimmed with the tiredness of someone who had not slept properly since the funeral. Her jaw worked as if she were secretly chewing on an impossible decision. Alan had left us alone after the reading. He'd smiled that slick, canned smile lawyers specialize in, the one that says everything is settled while someone else figures out how to pay for it. Robert had been louder, more theatrical, as though volume could undo his complicity. David hovered like a ghost, but smiled when it suited him. "No one told us the will would do this," Jenna said, though she knew better. She always knew better. "You didn't expect Uncle Gareth to leave a farm as a housewarming present to a man who'd only ever cared for blueprints?" I asked, feeling the absurdity hang between us like a fragile ornament. Joshua had called him Uncle Gareth, though he was really Joshua's father's brother, an uncle by marriage, a presence of money and odd pleasures. No one lived at Maple Creek anymore. Gareth's companies ran pipelines and leases across the province. We knew the name Western Plains the way you know the smell of gasoline, vaguely at a distance. She, Catherine, Alan had addressed me in the will reading as if I were a delicate clause to be argued over, is to be the sole beneficiary. All holdings pursuant to the attached plan. He tapped a folder that looked like any other bundle of corporate stationery. Then he looked up at Jenna and then, with a practiced neutrality, "This will invites a period of transition. There are regulatory reviews pending. We will manage them." What he meant, without saying it, was that transition could mean anything. It could mean audits. It could mean lawsuits. It could mean accusations landing like hailstones on whatever shelters we had left. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table and watched a video Joshua had made 3 months before he died. He'd left videos, many of them, addresses to me in his soft, unwinding way. They were small, domestic things. Him in the garage with an old ceramic mug, him tidying the mudroom, him explaining how to change a fuse. He sounded younger on camera, like a man who was rehearsing nostalgia. In this one, he held up a map of land parcels with a black marker and said, "If the name on the title ever feels like it will crush you, Cat, start with the water." He tapped a circled spot and smiled as if telling a joke I was meant to understand only when it mattered. I had married Joshua because he made me laugh and because he taught me to look for patterns in paper and stone in ways that translated well to a room full of children learning to read. At 52, I was still a teacher of literature, a safe harbor for adolescent anxieties and misread verbs. I was not a strategist. I had not planned for my husband's smoker cough to become a silence that filled the house. Yet from the first day the letters arrived from banks and estate managers and from the small medical office with its careful professionalism, I had the feeling of being moved across a chessboard while someone else decided the pieces. When Alan slid an envelope across his desk with Joshua's signature and 3 short sentences inside, "Watch these, trust no one," he might as well have handed me a detonator. The map on the table had a blue scribble marking the northeastern ridge of the farm. The phrase seismic survey reared up like a foreign animal. I had heard of pipelines. I had read articles with too heavy nouns and not enough faces. I had no idea how soil could be charted like a ledger until Joshua's voice explained it in the half-calm, half-urgent register he used when he thought no one else was listening. So I went to the farm. The road to Maple Creek was a ribbon of gravel, a line of worn stones, and the kind of winter that makes your mouth taste like tin. Snow had melted in patches, but the creek was high, and the smell of wet wood and peat rose from the fields like memory. The house looked smaller up close, its restoration a careful lie. The white paint had been chosen to suggest simplicity, not fortune. The porch wrapped around in a friendly, domestic way. A line of wind-bent maples guarded the drive. A single horse, Midnight, stood in the paddock and turned his head to watch as the car crunched in. Jenna's hand found mine when we walked up the planked path. "We shouldn't," she said. Alan said never go to the farm," I finished. The absurd circle of it made me laugh, a small sound jagged with grief. "That was Uncle Gareth's handwriting, Jenna. Joshua wrote, 'Start in the loft.' People like instructions. They like to think they can make their living wills tidy." The house smelled of polish and lemon and old paper. Joshua's tools were laid out on a workbench as though he would return for them in the morning. His jacket hung by the back door where he'd always leave it, a soft, blue threadbare thing with a cigarette burn near the cuff he had never quite mended. On the mantel sat a small photograph, Joshua, younger, smiling at a man with steely eyes I recognized as Gareth. The photograph was frayed at the corners, a rectangle of summer. The loft was a room with northern light and a floor that creaked politely. It had been made into a study. A single sofa sagged near a window. Books were stacked by subject. A small metal box with an old brass lock sat tucked under a stack of geological journals. When I pressed the maple leaf key into the lock, it turned as if it had been waiting years for the touch of my hand. Inside the box were 3 things: a laptop with a password-protected drive, a sealed envelope marked with Joshua's handwriting and the word "Open First," and a small notebook with lines of minute script. I read the notebook on the loft floor with my knees pulled into my chest and the light making bands across the pages. Joshua's handwriting was thrifty and precise. His sentences were like threads he had tied into knots. He wrote about Gareth, about the way Gareth's generosity had leavened into something else. Leases signed in haste, easements arranged with lawyers who did not ask enough questions, geotechnical reports with language that suggested profit over precaution. He wrote about a project called North Ridge, about test wells and casing that hadn't been properly sealed. He wrote about a report he'd found, printed in a dull office up in the city, that suggested contamination tracing downstream. "You were always the one who felt such things," he had written to himself in the margins, as if to explain why he had spent nights with spreadsheets and midnight calls. "You saw the line of the creek before anyone named it a problem." The first video was simple. Joshua, in the garage, the light around him like a halo. He looked at the camera and called me Cat with a softness that made my chest ache. "If Uncle Gareth's will lands on your lap like an anvil, I want you to know what to do with it," he said. He spoke in the 2 a.m. cadence of someone who had rehearsed truth. He explained the basics: titles, mineral rights, the difference between holding a deed and holding a liability. He said words like shell companies and front leases and restoration bond. He pointed the camera at a map and circled a patch of land with a red marker. "This is where they buried the first of the pipes," he said. "If Western Plains tries to sell you a story about legacy holdings, look for the interruptions in the contours." The videos came like petals at a funeral, one after the other, each revealing a layer of an elaborate plan. In some, he was light: recipes, how to light a fire, how to reset a breaker. In others, he was grave, and the camera drew close as if the viewer needed intimacy to absorb what he was about to say. He had made a schedule, an instruction set. He had looked at me through a lens and anticipated a siege. "You won't be alone," he promised in one, but he also told me not to trust Robert, to be careful with Alan's smile, and to keep Jenna close. There was a logic to his caution that felt like a map back to the loft box where his notes had been kept. He had labeled files with absurd thoroughness: Evidence-1, Survey-A, Accounting Checklist. One file contained a scanned copy of a seismic survey that showed anomalies under the farm's northeastern ridge, anomalies that could indicate poor casing, which could in turn mean seepage into the aquifer. "Kat," he said in another recording, "you might have to go to the police. You might have to talk to a regulator. You might also have to keep it private for a time. There's a war that needs planning." He used the word war without flourish, like a tradesman naming a necessary inconvenience. He had built a war room. The barn at Maple Creek was bigger than the house and smelled like hay and horse and the kind of labor that keeps a place honest. Midnight stamped his hoof when I walked into the stall. He had the deep horse breath smell that makes you feel like the world is larger than your grief. The barn's floorboards hit a trapdoor, and beneath the trapdoor was a door with a heavy padlock and a keypad. When Ellis, who had been Joshua's stable manager and had returned to help with the estate, saw the key, his faith unclenched like a hand releasing a rock. "You always did ask questions, Kat," he said, turning the padlock with a practiced wrist. Ellis had been in Joshua's life long before we were married, a big man with the kind of hands that are made for repair. He had a history I didn't know how to unpack. Ex-con, if whispers on the town bus were to be believed, but also a steadiness that made him indispensable. He had kept the stables running after Gareth had outsourced everything else. He had a way of opening a wrench and a way of folding grief into work. The war room was a space Joshua had created like a small conspiratorial theater. A table scarred by use, a whiteboard, a projector, boxes of documents, cabinets of labeled files. The walls were peppered with maps on butcher paper, pins marking leased tracts, colored string like veins connecting points of interest. On the central table sat a ring binder with a red sticker that read, "For court if necessary." Inside, neat piles of bank statements sat beside environmental reports and photographs of test draws. There were emails printed out and annotated with Joshua's handwriting in the margins, phone numbers circled, names underlined. "This is why he kept coming back up here," Ellis said. He cleared his throat. Said it was the only place he could think straight. I ran my fingers along one of the maps and felt the ridges of pencil lead where Joshua had worked too hard to make things clear. There were layers upon layers, property lines, survey notes, dates of drilling permits. Somebody with enough money and enough connections, had hurried to cover tracks. Leases had been signed with a man whose firm dissolved the next month. A restoration bond had been posted in a jurisdiction 6 hours away, and its paper trail led into a nest of shell companies. Jenna sat at the table with her chin in her hands. Her face had an oldness to it I didn't like, an expression that said she was trying too hard not to be swept away. "Why would Gareth do this?" she asked, and I felt the old ache of wanting every answer returned to an innocence I could restore. "Money makes people greedy," I said, "because sometimes honesty is the only currency left, and secrecy makes greed possible." There were other things in the war room, a sealed envelope with Joshua's handwriting that said, "Read at funeral," a digital recorder with audio of phone conversations between Gareth and a man called Mercer, whose voice was all gravel and certainty. There were photographs of a creek bank with discolored water and fish floating, images that felt like evidence in a criminal case, even as I turned them and felt my stomach lurch. When Alan found out I had been to the farm, he did not come with arguments, he came with threats. "The RCMP have already been in contact," he said in the polished calm of a man who has been trained to say things like that without betraying his relief. "It's complicated, Kat. When large holdings are involved, the Crown sometimes establishes a temporary administrator. That could mean oversight. It could mean freezing assets." "Freeze all you like," Robert said, leaning back in the leather chair and folding his hands on his belly like a man who'd always expected dessert. "But leaving you everything, well, that's a generous gesture from Gareth. You won't be able to manage that farm without help." "We could help." For a fee. His smile was a small, predatory thing. Why were you all so eager to sign those leases? I asked, and the room went quiet. The word you then felt like a dart. We're family, David said, too quickly. You don't ask questions about family. The brothers circled like dogs around a carcass of propriety. Their interest in the estate wore a thin veil called concern. Behind Alan's practiced phrases, there was a hunger that had been grown and curated for business lunches and tax filings. Their suits smelled faintly of cologne. Mine smelled of highway and lemon. Joshua's videos had prepared me for this. They had given me a structure, a sequence of actions. He had anticipated the first calls, the thinly veiled threats. He had left instructions for how to document everything. If they try to freeze Maple Creek, he had said in one recording, make a list, put the list in the binder, take photographs with a timestamp, get a sworn statement from Ellis, get Jenna to sign any receipt of correspondence. If Alan smiles, record the smile. So we recorded, we cataloged, we printed out emails, we called Ellis as a witness, and he came the next morning with his stable ledger tucked under his arm, his fingers smelling of leather and liniment. He swore an affidavit about the horse leases and the maintenance work that had never been properly billed. Jenna sent emails from her marketing account that placed certain communications in a timeline that seemed inconvenient to the brothers' story. It felt like building a house out of proof. Each page was a brick. But proof is not the same as exoneration. Within 2 weeks, a provincial regulator had flagged suspicious transfers between a subsidiary of Western Plains and a shell company registered in a different province. The regulator's correspondence was courteous and clinical, the kind of paper that turns polite people into frightened ones. Somewhere in the bureaucratic garden, someone had noticed discrepancies. Complaints had been filed. An investigative unit had opened a file. The RCMP, per Alan's offhand comment, had begun to ask questions. What are they really going to do? Jenna asked one night as we sat at the kitchen table. The war room's printed maps fanned like cards between us. Can they charge me? Charge you? Charge the estate? They can charge whoever appears to have benefited from wrongdoing, Alan said when he wasn't there to say it. Instead, Robert called in with a tone of wounded proprietorship. And Alan sent an email with legalese that suggested the institution of criminal investigation could move swiftly when there were reasons. The idea that I could be accused, not merely suspected, but accused, sat on my shoulders like a weight that made the room tilt. In one video, Joshua had been blunt. You might have to go to the police and say you didn't know, he said. You might also, if it comes to that, have to accept that being a beneficiary looks bad on paper. The Crown likes patterns. That's why I left you the ledger. His voice was steady. He told me to save copies of everything. He told me to keep Jenna away from the brothers. He told me to get an independent counsel. And then, as if he had felt the shape of what a prosecutor would say, he added, they could try to seat you in the narrative they want. They could say you knew or you should have known. The thing that will save you is the chain of custody and a willingness to let the truth make enemies. Let the truth make enemies. His phrasing was almost flippant, and then I realized it wasn't flippant at all. Standing in the loft with the laptop and the key and the maple leaf, I understood the ugly arithmetic being presented to me. To inherit could be to indict. To accept the farm could be to invite a prosecution. The detectives and the regulators would look at the beneficiary and see a convenient defendant. The brothers could make that look tidy by feeding the narrative to the right people. Must I go to jail? I whispered to the dark between maps, feeling suddenly like a fraud for asking such a private, theatrical question. There was no answer, only the soft creak of the building as it settled into night. Outside, midnight shifted his weight, scraping a hoof on straw. In the loft, Joshua's recorded voice said, as though reading the thought off my spine, "You might, but not if we do this right. We did not have a guarantee. We had a plan. The plan began with allies. A small law firm Joshua had trusted because one of its partners had once represented an environmental NGO. Ellis, whose testimony was simple and true. Jenna, whose knowledge of branding could be turned into something called narrative control if we allowed the language to get ugly. And a cold cell of digital copies, metadata intact. We started calling people who owed Joshua favors. People who had been in his life not out of social convenience, but because he had fixed things for them. Some answered, some did not. One evening, a man named Mercer drove down the farm road with a leather briefcase and provincial arrogance and sat at the table where Joshua's maps lay. He'd been a player in Garrett's world and had stepped back when Gareth died. He had the habit of smoothing his tie when uncomfortable. Mercer had been the face on some of the recorded phone calls. His presence dealt like a bruise. "I can arrange a deal," Mercer said, removing his gloves slowly and placing them on the table like a small ritual. "Western Plains wants to limit liability. They'd like you to accept a settlement that makes the matter civil rather than criminal. It avoids headlines." "Make it civil," Robert said, as if offering a bargain. "Avoid jail. Why make it messy?" "Because sometimes avoiding headlines is a way of paying less and getting more," Mercer answered. He looked straight at me as if testing the lens I saw the world through. "You would need to admit a degree of oversight. It would be a written acknowledgement that you, as beneficiary, had at least constructive knowledge. In legal terms, constructive knowledge is a net you can cast wide. It does not require intent. It requires that a reasonable person would have known. It can become leverage. It can become a charge." "If I signed anything," I said, feeling the kitchen table as if it were an altar, "it will be on the record that I did so with counsel. I will not plead to something I did not do." "Then you'll have a fight on your hands." Alan's email to me the next day expanded the circle of consequences. Freezing orders, potential trust arrangements, the kind of slow, expensive chipping that could reduce a person to exhaustion. You might have to go to court. You might have to answer criminal allegations. It would be best to discuss a plea. There it was again, that phrase, "you might have to go to jail." It floated like a clause with teeth. Joshua's videos were our arsenal. They told not only what had happened, but why. Gareth had been reckless, and he had used corporate structures to ensure his mistakes would be swallowed by distance and bureaucracy. He had, in late nights of conscience, begun to document anomalies, leaks, misfiled permits, a lab report he didn't trust. He had spoken to Mercer and been brushed off. He had argued with his uncle in veiled, careful ways. And then, in one recording I found in a folder labeled Public, he looked at the camera and said, "If what I think is true, I could make this worse by telling you everything. So I'm going to lay it out in pieces. You must decide which pieces to use when the wolves come." Wolves was the word he used for the brothers more than once. We were not without leverage. There were photographs with dates, with GPS coordinates, with timestamps and metadata that I had learned to read like a language. There were bank transfers that tracked backwards like breadcrumbs. There was a man named Mercer who had been less slick than he believed. But evidence does not win alone. It has to be heard by the right people, in the right sequence, and with the pressure of public eyes when necessary. I called a lawyer Joshua had recommended, Leah Anders, sharp, 40, with a reputation for not panicking. She took my call and asked one question before the rest of the intake. "Are you prepared for a criminal investigation?" "Prepared?" I echoed, tasting the word. "Yes. No. I don't know what that even would mean." She came to Maple Creek with a small legal team and a stubbornness like a blade. She looked at the maps, at the binder with its red sticker, at the video files, and at me. And then she said, "This is messy. It is also winnable if we play carefully." She advised me to secure the devices, to refrain from posting anything publicly, to get Jenna off social media, to have Ellis make a written statement about the maintenance of pipes and wells. She made a list with bullet points that felt in that moment like a harness. "We will have to show chain of custody," she said. "We will have to show you did not profit through concealment. We might have to accept administrative penalties if..." They insist, but we will fight the criminal narrative. If they press for a plea, her eyes met mine then, sharp and clear, we'll evaluate, but no one should talk about "you must go to jail" as though it's inevitable. And yet, even as she spoke, I thought of the headline I had not wanted to imagine: "Widowed beneficiary charged in Western Plains scandal." The clean sentence would pound at the door of every neighbor and friend. The school would get calls. My life would be compressed into a pendant of accusation. The first of Joshua's staged moves to shift narrative came in a video labeled Strategy_02. He explained how to release a sealed letter that Gareth had written and left unopened, intended for a public reading. The letter was ethically explosive. Gareth had admitted in it a responsibility for certain decisions, and he had, in the letter, named a person who had encouraged speed over care. He had not named that person directly in public documents, but the handwriting matched the scanned copies we had. Joshua's plan was to let Gareth's voice be heard in a way that complicated the story. If Gareth confessed to pressuring others and to mistakes of omission, the narrative would not sit comfortably on the shoulders of a widow. "We stage the release," Joshua said in the video. "We make it public in a way that shows contrition and process, not hysteria. We sit with Leah. We call the regulator. We do this with a spine." Leah approved. "If Gareth's letter contains the right language," she said, "it could inoculate you against a narrative of conspiracy. It won't make the regulators go away, but it will make the story more about corporate failure than personal fraud." There was a small, resistant part of me that recoiled at the idea that Gareth's posthumous confession could be shaped into a legal strategy. Morality does not like choreography. But Joshua had always been a cold reader of consequences. He believed in laying things out so clear that even spite couldn't twist them beyond recognition. I wanted his voice to be right. I wanted to be justified by evidence and the truth. And I wanted, selfishly, to show Jenna that we could survive the ugliness without sacrificing the farm. At the same time, the Mitchell brothers were not merely passive predators. They moved through the province's corporate circles with a practiced ease. Robert called a press briefing the week we started to file documents. Alan sent out an email to the boards, the registries, the people who counted for things. Their narrative used an economist's language: mismanagement, oversight, a beneficiary poorly briefed. They insinuated that the farm could not be preserved without a management change. They called into question my capacity, as though competence were a thing you could adjudicate from a distance. They were asking the wrong question. The real question, the one hidden beneath acreage and ledgers, was about culpability. If benefit equaled knowledge, then the brothers' insistence that I be removed from the equation would be a legal wedge to argue that I had recognized the issues and still taken them. They were building a frame where I, as beneficiary, was the most plausible defendant. One morning, a letter arrived marked with the RCMP crest. Its language was official and polite and precise. It said an investigation had been opened into possible environmental and financial irregularities associated with the Northridge project, and that certain parties would be invited for voluntary interviews. It included an invitation to speak. There was no summons. There was instead the suggestion of an inevitability, an opening in a door that could lead to interrogation rooms with fluorescent lights and folding chairs. Leah put her hand on mine across the war room table. "We will answer," she said. "We will present the map. We will present Joshua's files. We will demand an evidence plan. But be prepared for pressure. Be prepared for a request for cooperation that asks you to name names. Sometimes cooperation means telling the truth about who did what. If the brothers try to paint you as a conspirator, we will respond with the chain of custody and with Gareth's letter." "But cooperating," Jenna started, and her voice broke. She had the look of someone being asked to step into the stained light of adulthood. "Cooperating doesn't mean giving up," Leah said. "It means telling what is true." When the RCMP investigator, Detective Sergeant Hargreaves, a broad-shouldered woman with a voice like gravel and tea, came to Maple Creek, she asked questions that made the furniture seem accusatory. She asked who had access to the accounts, who had signed which documents, whether we'd met with Mercer. She asked if I'd consented to any transfers the week Gareth died. I answered as Leah coached me, plainly, with documents to back my words, and with a refusal to be coaxed into speculation. Detective Hargreaves listened, her face unreadable. She took photographs of the maps and of the war room binder. She said she would not comment on whether the inquiry would lead to charges. She would only say that all leads will be pursued. That was the moment the title in the back of my throat felt real. My millionaire uncle left me everything, but I must go to jail for his crime. The clause had a life of its own. It was not yet an indictment. It was an incantation of possibility. That night, I watched a video Joshua had recorded, not for me, but for public release in case of emergency. He sat at his workbench with his hands folded, the light caught in his hair. "If they say the beneficiary must answer for what the uncle did," he said, his voice steady, "then first let them hear the uncle's own admission. Then let the regulators see the trail. The law moves slowly, Kat, but it moves. If you must be in the frame, make it the frame of someone who wanted to fix things." His words were both plan and plea. I listened until my eyes stung. Jenna slept on the sofa that night and dreamed of children she had not yet met. Midnight stood at the stall and tossed his head in the moon. The decisions ahead were not only legal, they were moral. I could accept a settlement that might keep me out of a courtroom, but at the price of naming myself as complicit. I could refuse and risk a trial, a public spectacle that might end in ruin. Leah argued for a third path, to make the scandal about systems, about Gareth, about Western Plains, about Mercer, about the corporate structures Gareth had used to spread risk and concentrate profit. The war room's maps would be the heart of the argument. But the brothers had another weapon. Robert had quietly leaked a piece of information to the press. A scanned page from a ledger showing a transfer into an account co-signed in my name. The photo was cropped to exclude metadata. The headline read, "Widowed wife beneficiary in question." The comment boards were brutal and literal. Strangers invented a story about my supposed ambition and my alleged naivete. Jenna read the comments and then closed the laptop with a snap like a book being slammed shut on a childhood. "You're going to have to step into the public," Leah said gently. "You'll have to give an interview, controlled, narrow, but public." "And watch them eat me alive," I said. Leah's eyes were patient and contained something like pity. Better to be eaten alive on your terms than to be eaten alive as a mystery. The war room hummed with plans. We would release Garrett's letter in a staged way. We would invite a regulator to a controlled meeting. We would use Joshua's videos as a backbone for the timeline. We would ask for a public audit. We would not, however, let Alan or Robert lead the narrative any longer. The first public move was small, a press release that announced an independent environmental assessment and the opening of our records to an impartial committee. The release was cautious, careful, not to admit liability, but it used the language of restoration and of responsibility. Robert responded with scorn. Alan suggested it was a stunt. The press ate the swirl and moved on to other scandals. A week later, at a community hall meeting we organized to show concern rather than guilt, a man in the back stood and spoke quietly about fish in his creek and children who had played along the bank. His words landed like weight. The room was not a courtroom, but it was a jury of sorts. Jenna cried quietly and held my hand as neighbors nodded. Some looked at me with suspicion, others with weary curiosity. We were not absolved, but the story had shifted a fraction, away from one woman's supposed greed and toward a conversation about land and water. 2 days after that, the RCMP sent an email again. This time, the tone was more direct. The investigation had expanded. There were allegations not just of environmental negligence, but of financial irregularity. Transfers, shell corporations, potential offenses under the criminal code regarding possession and concealment of proceeds. The letter suggested that being a beneficiary and being involved with certain transactions could be linked. Leah sighed when she read it. They are building the narrative, she said. They are stitching threads. We need to show them these are separate ropes. Do you think they'll charge me? I asked, feeling the floor tilt. She looked at me as if measuring a map. They could, if they think you're the easiest defendant. They look for someone whose pastness makes for good headlines. You're a symbol now, Kat, whether you ask to be or not. There was a moment in which I considered everything. Giving up the farm, taking an agreement, leaving Maple Creek to the brothers if it could spare me from courtrooms. The thought made my throat constrict. The farm was more than acreage. It was where Joshua had taught me to see lines in the land. It was where Jenna had first learned to ride. It was a place of horses and canvases and the smell of oil and the slow comfort of a house being lived in. If the price of keeping the farm was a plea that admitted a complicity I did not possess, I could not pay it. If the price of freedom was to let Gareth's companies off the hook, I could not live with the knowledge of it. On the desk in the war room, a sealed envelope with Gareth's folded hand had been waiting. Joshua's last video about the letter had told me how to read it and how to present it. Make them listen to Gareth, he had said. If your uncle confesses, it ruins the easy scapegoat. But there are no perfect plans. The brothers reacted. Robert, with the company's PR machine humming like a hive, accused us of manufacturing Gareth's confession. Alan quietly threatened to seek an injunction to prevent the public reading of the letter, claiming it as part of an estate dispute that required adjudication. The brothers were playing for time and for the court of public opinion. I was not naive. The scale of this was larger than me. The notion that I must go to jail hummed like a mosquito in my ear. There was a threshold ahead, a point at which I would be asked to prove everything in a room designed to strip certainty naked. The title, cruel as a fortune-telling, had planted itself in the story of my life. But I had Joshua's footage, Gareth's pen, Ellis's testimony, Jenna's courage, and Leah's steady, cold-eyed counsel. We had maps and timestamps and the smell of fresh paint drying on the studio wall. We had Midnight, who would not be sold. Had the neighbor who spoke up about children and creeks. And we had, hidden in a folder, a file named Mercer_calls that Joshua had flagged with red ink. The next morning, Leah drove to the nearest city to meet with a journalist she trusted, someone who had written honestly about corporate malfeasance before. She left instructions: do not yield to pressure, do not be drawn into small talk, present Gareth's letter as context and Joshua's evidence as a foundation. I watched her go down the lane and felt the war room's lights hum in the silence. When the phone rang in the afternoon, it was Detective Sergeant Hargreaves. She asked, calmly, whether I would come down to the station for a voluntary interview and whether I would bring the laptop containing Joshua's videos. Yes, I said. My voice made a small, strange echo in the loft like a bell struck in a distant room. Yes, I'll bring it. The car to the station felt too loud with its own engines and not loud enough with the question that had been growing since the envelopes were parted. Would I be willing to tell the truth in a room that had been designed to find culpability? Would I be willing to watch my name cross a page in an official report? I drove as if the road ran toward a cliff. The maples watched me go. Inside the war room, the maps lay like open palms. Jenna packed a bag. Ellis stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled, his hands rough and honest. "Whatever happens," he said, "you keep your head. You don't make a joke for them." "Neither do they," I answered. "They think they own the shape of everything." He gave a short, dark laugh. "People always think they own what they don't." At the station, Detective Hargreaves led me into a small interview room. The table was gray and the light softer than I had feared. Across from me sat a woman with a notebook and a pen like a scalpel. "Are you afraid of prison?" she asked suddenly, not as an investigator, but as someone recognizing the human animal in the prey. For a long moment, I had to think about that. I had rehearsed the answer, and yet the real answer felt like a weather pattern. "Of course," I said. "I'm afraid of losing what is mine to love. I'm afraid of being used as a cautionary tale." She nodded once. "I need you to tell me everything, Miss Mitchell. Do not omit things because you think they will make you look bad. If you are honest with me, it helps us put crimes where they belong." I didn't know if honesty would lead to jail or to freedom. I only knew the truth between the maps and the videotapes. Gareth had been reckless. Gareth had been greedy. Gareth had buried damage in contracts. I had married a man who couldn't sit with silence when he found wrong. Joshua had tried to fix what he could, and he had left me instructions like a will of fire for the living. So I told Detective Hargreaves about the ledger with the cropped page. I told her about Mercer. I told her about the map with the red circle. I told her about a phone call between Gareth and Mercer from a recording Joshua had made. I told her about the sealed letter and how I intended to make it public. She wrote it down with a slow, steady hand. When I left the station, the sky had the brittle clarity of winter, and the road home felt longer than before. The photograph from the ledger still hovered at the edge of my mind. My name, cropped, coercively suggesting guilt. Back at the farm, the war room felt like a harbor after the sea. Jenna met me at the door and took my hand as if to anchor me. "What did she say?" she asked, simple and necessary. "She said she'd put it on the record," I replied. "She said everything we say now will be part of a file." "It could go either way," Jenna said. "It always does," I answered. "We're in the middle of other people's choices now." That night, I sat at the studio with a blank canvas leaning against an easel. Joshua had wanted me to paint more. He had told me my hands were good at shaping light. I had always put the brush down for practicality, syllabi, gradebooks, the daily needs of life. Now the canvas felt like an accusation and a possibility. I mixed pigments with a small, trembling hand and thought of the farm as if it were a subject in a class I had been asked to teach, a landscape of ethical complications. I painted a line for the creek, a smear for the ridge, a bright, impossible slash for the maples. Midnight's profile cut across the bottom like a steady anchor. The paint dried in a smell of linseed oil, a smell that seemed to say endurance. Outside, the night breathed cold. Inside, the war room hummed. Leah had scheduled the public reading of Garrett's letter for the following week, after assurances from an independent journalist. The RCMP had indicated they would be making their own moves. Alan had threatened an injunction. Robert hinted at a corporate maneuver that could place the estate under management. The brothers were tightening, and everywhere I looked, I saw the geometry of a trap. I thought of Joshua's voice, calm, rehearsed, loving, and felt the odd consolation of being guided by someone whose instructions could not be undone by grief. I thought of the map, of chains of custody, of how evidence could change the shape of accusation. I thought of the idea that sometimes you must walk into a danger in order to move past it. If the title of this story spoke true, if my millionaire uncle's death placed me under suspicion, so severe that I must go to jail for his crime hung like a sword, then I would not make it an inevitability. I would not make my life a neat narrative for other people's moral satisfaction. I would fight and tend horses and be present to Jenna. I would do the slow, honest thing. The next morning, a text came through from an unknown number. We've been looking into Gareth for years. We have dirt. Meet me at the cafe at 9. The sender's name was blank. Sometimes help arrives like a knock on a back door. Sometimes it comes in the form of an offer you can't entirely trust. I folded the map in my hands and felt the ridge like a bone beneath paper. The war had only begun in the way Joshua had said it would, with small moves that might become decisive if only we could see the right string to pull. I put on my coat and walked to the cafe, the maple leaf key warm in my pocket. The town was sleeping under a thin crust of frost, and the world smelled, for a moment, like possibility. I did not know whether I would ever go to jail. I knew only that the path that might lead there, by papers misread, by signatures misplaced, could be rerouted if we were clever enough and stubborn enough to insist on the truth. The bell above the cafe door chimed as I entered. A woman at the counter looked up and blinked, then pointed toward a man at the window with a cup of black coffee and a face I did not recognize. He had the same kind of eyes that had been in Gareth's photograph, the look of people who had watched too much of the world to be surprised by anything. He stood as I approached. "You must be Catherine Mitchell," he said. "Yes," I answered. "And you are?" He placed an envelope on the table without looking at it, as if it belonged there more than to him. "Call me Evans. I used to do audits for Western Plains. I found things. I thought you should see them before someone else did." He did not look like a savior. He looked like someone who had been awake for a very long time with a ledger. The envelope between us was thin but heavy with implication. When I slid my finger under the fold and opened it, a photograph slid into the autumn light, and the world narrowed to a single image, a report, stamped and initialed by a consultant who had worked for Gareth, that tied a payment to a shell company. At the bottom, in a different hand, was a date and a note. Mercer, follow funds. The spiral of evidence tightened. I felt the past and the present meet in a single crystalline possibility. We could follow the money. If we followed it far enough, perhaps we could show the path that led away from me and toward the men who had profited from obfuscation. Perhaps we could make it plain that my inheritance was not a clean, isolated prize, but a parcel in a larger crime. And perhaps, if we did it in time, the phrase that had noosed itself around my life, "You must go to jail," would break like thin string. I put the photograph back in its envelope and slid it toward Evans. "Show me everything," I said. He smiled in a way that suggested he had been waiting to hear me say it. "I already have." We began then to follow the money. We began to trace receipts and transfers through jurisdictions that liked secrecy. We began to call names that had been whispered in Joshua's videos and to find them where they lived, in offices with frosted glass and in voicemail boxes that answered with corporate poetry. Each call felt like walking a ridge where one wrong step could send you over the edge. And through it all, in the back of my mind, the words danced. My millionaire uncle left me everything, but I must go to jail for his crime. I did not know whether the sentence would be true in the end. I only knew that if I was going to be anything in the story, victim, hero, or neither, I would choose to be the kind of person who insists the truth be told. The war room hummed late into the night as documents printed, as inked notes formed into a map you could hold. Jenna slept on the sofa with midnight's breath ventilating the stall nearby. Ellis mended a fence in the frost, the edges of his gloves frayed like talons. The battle ahead would be both slow and swift. It would involve courtrooms and coffee shops, press conferences, and whispered phone calls, a public reading of a letter that might redeem or damn us. It would ask me, at moments, to be braver than I had thought possible and to choose the kind of life Joshua had half prepared me to inhabit. When I stepped back into the loft that night, the northern light had dwindled to a thin sliver. I sat at the easel and painted a final line, a small vertical streak that suggested a fence post. The canvas began to look like a place that could be lived in, imperfect and enduring. There would be interviews, there would be accusations, there would be the possibility of jail. But there would also be maps and letters and the slow, patient work of assembling truth. If I had to go to jail for my uncle's crime, I would not go unarmed. I would not go without making the case that the crime was not mine. Outside, the wind moved the maples, and they made a sound like a crowd shifting. The next morning, the world would begin again, with coffee and calls and a thin film of frost on the path. I pressed my palm to Joshua's old jacket on the peg and felt the empty shape of him. "You were always the one who saw the lines," I whispered to the air where his breath had been, and then I turned off the loft light and walked down to the war room where the maps waited, lit and patient. We would follow the thread. We would see where it led. We would not be passive in our own story. The question of jail, of whether the phrase in the title was prophecy or temptation, hung over everything like a promise or a threat. I opened the envelope Evans had brought again and ran my finger over the note. Mercer. Follow funds. The war had a name now and a set of coordinates. I set the photograph onto the projector and watched the light make it larger, its details clearer. The image filled the wall like a confession. It was time to begin the part Joshua had always known would come. The projection, the public reading, the fight. I felt for the first time in months a small steadiness. We would go to the hearings, we would call witnesses, we would demand the full accounting. We would let Gareth's voice be heard in the careful way he had written it. We would not avoid the word jail as if it were a curse. We would treat it as a possible outcome and prepare to avoid it. As the projector hummed, I thought of the title and felt it like a seam I could either tear or mend. The next move would determine which. Outside, through the open oven door, a truck light came down the road. Someone was coming. I stood up, took the envelope, and walked to the door.